Hi, this is your host Swapnil Bhartiya, and welcome to another episode of Dirk and Swap Conversations on Open Source. And as usual, we have with us Dirk Hohndel, VP and Chief Open Source Officer at VMware. Dirk, today we're going to talk about what makes a project appropriate for enterprise use. Now, it's not just about, hey, this project is good, let's use it. There's so many different things that we have to talk about. Where I want to start from is that when we look at, it's not just about project. Even if you look at product, like if you're going to buy a commercial product, we still choose, hey, which company we should buy from. It's not like, hey, it's a commercial product, everything is good. So that is applicable here as well. Just because it's open source doesn't mean it doesn't have. So there are a lot of nuts and bolts in this one. So I ask you, where would you like to start with for this topic?
Let's start at the very bottom of the logical building that we're building here, and let's start at what does it mean to be good enough, to be right, to be appropriate for enterprise use. And a lot of people seem to want to brush over this and say, oh, it's open source, it's awesome. Well, open source is just a license. It's a methodology how something is developed. You want to understand who creates this project. What is their background? What is their target audience? What were their design criteria? How is it being maintained? Is there a security methodology behind it? How are they dealing with issues that crop up? What is the responsiveness of the project to concerns that users have? And I'll give you an extreme example. I was talking to a customer of ours about a project that they were using in-house for one of their internal products. And it turns out that project was a computer science 101 experiment of a student who had stopped working on that 6 years prior. And the target scale that the student had looked at was hundreds of items. And they were using that project in their in-house product for a data stream that has hundred thousands of items. And unsurprisingly, they were running into performance issues and correctness issues. And my response to them was, well, didn't you look at this? Didn't you do an assessment if this was enterprise grade? And the response back was, oh, we found it in a Google search and it seemed to do exactly what we wanted. And so that really is the first level of thought that needs to go into this. If you're using open source projects in an enterprise, in a productive environment, was that built for your use case, with your scale, with your security concerns, with all this in mind? And is it still maintained? Is there a community around that still takes care of this project?
This is such an interesting example that you gave that we just found on Google and picked it up. The thing is, you did answer some of those things, but how would somebody know that this project is enterprise grade? Because there are a lot of projects which are maintained by community, but maybe enterprise use is not what I have talked to a lot of open source projects, and that is pure. It's a big, massive community, but that is intended for individuals, or hobbies, or maybe you can talk about NGOs, and they would not even want to talk about commercial. They don't even have a company who is backing that project commercially. So how to actually know that the project is ready for enterprise use case? Of course, you should look at community, of course, sustainability of the project, so that the project is still there. And of course, when was the last patch applied, right? I remember I don't want to name those companies. One more thing is that even if you are using a purely open source project, you are not dealing with a commercial vendor there, it does give you a kind of plan B. There is a very popular music service. They switched from one fully open source distribution to other one, which also had commercial backing. And one of the reasons they said was that these commercial project, even if we are using the free version, they have point releases. So we do know when their update will come out, so we can plan our own internal updates, versus it will be released whenever it is ready. So suddenly they have really dropped a release and the support cycle is only 6 months and now you're stuck. So there are so many components that you have to look at when it comes to, so it's a very tricky topic, to be honest.
Yeah, so let's start at the beginning of your question where you said, so how do you analyze that? And obviously one of the things that a lot of people say, hey, I prefer projects that are kind of corporate open source, where there is a large company that seems to be behind it, that supports it, that is actively engaged, or it's driven by a foundation. We've talked about foundation-based projects a lot here in our conversations. But the reality is that a large swath of open source projects isn't built that way. They are built by communities, by enthusiasts. And so what you do is you look at their response, typically on GitHub or wherever they host their sources. Look at their responses to issues that are being posted. Look at their responses to pull requests that come in. Is this a responsive community? Is this a community that understands the concerns that are being brought in? And if you're doubtful, hey, raise an issue and in the project and say, I'm considering using your project. I'm expecting data set size of millions of items. I need sub-millisecond response time. I have 99.99 uptime requirements. Here is roughly the infrastructure into which I put this. And see what the community members say. Because what may happen to you is that they say, oh, no, that is not the scale we've ever considered. Or they say, hey, that's cool. Let us know how it goes. Let us know how we can help. And it's that interaction that you're looking for. You're looking to understand how much do they care about your concern? How much do they think that your problem is something that they are interested in? Or on the flip side, do they give you a strong sense of that they don't care, they don't want the responsibility, they don't want to be on the hook for security updates? And that's another thing. So the CII security badge is kind of a really cool thing, or some other form of a public acknowledgement of a security philosophy. If you want to use an open source project in an enterprise environment, it really has to have a security philosophy. It has to have an approach to how do we deal with rapidly releasing updates to existing releases. There should be a concept of a stable branch. There should be a concept of a how do we respond when between one release and the next release we have an issue come up. We've seen quite a few open source projects that seem to assume that the user is actually running their development branch, and they don't have a concept of providing updates to older releases. That's great for hobbyists. That's great for developers. In a production environment, that should be an immediate exclusionary criterion. If that's what you see, maybe you find something else.
Also, when we do look at a project, I also you mentioned security. There are other things also. Should I also look at if there are people like me who are using that project, so that you do feel, because sometimes the issues that you deal with, other members may not even come across them. So should you also look at who is the actual active users of the project? I mean, you should do a lot of research on the project to see. At the same time, you may be the one who is breaking the ice, who is bringing that project into that kind of use case. So that is also there.
Yeah, so looking at the community of users is often very interesting and enlightening. If you obviously see a lot of people from a similar industry at a similar scale with similar concerns, that's a strong endorsement of the project, clearly. But I don't think the opposite is true. Being the first person from a new industry, with a new vision of how a project could be used, is not necessarily a bad thing. The question is, does the community entertain this use of their software? Are they willing to work with you if you run into an issue, whether it's scalability or performance or security or just models? So very often we see projects that make assumptions about, let's say, data locality, about network infrastructure. How does this work? Is everything on the same Class C subnet? Very simple things that, of course, in an enterprise environment, you can never make such assumptions. But the developers might make these assumptions because that's true for every environment that they have ever worked in. And so to me, this is all about taking the time to assess the projects that you need. And when people push back at me and say, oh, it's just open source, I should be just able to use it. I'm like, before you purchase a product, you hopefully will look at reviews. You hopefully will make sure that the product is fit for your purpose. And when you are starting to use an open source project in your enterprise environment, that is exactly what you're doing. You may not be paying an upfront purchase price, but you are committing resources to this project, because once it's part of your architecture, if things go wrong, you are on the hook to fix it or to find someone who can fix it. And so you need to do that same level of due diligence, whether you decide to buy a new database infrastructure platform for millions of dollars, or whether you bring in an open source project, because you need to understand what it is, what you're starting to use here.
You mentioned security, and you also mentioned CII batch. One more thing is that when you do use these kind of open source projects, compliance also becomes, because you mix so many components, so you might be violating somebody's, I mean, there have been so many cases where, that company, because you may not know where you're going to use that code base, so you should also look at the licenses as well. So it is kind of a complicated mess there. We have talked about containers earlier, where you said you talked to, and they did not even know what core components they were using in their component, where they're coming from, where they're hardening. So it can also happen with if you're using a project which is very well known, but it is also plugging in a lot of other components that you may or may not even aware of. So how much awareness should be there about every piece of code that you're consuming, even if you are using a, let's say, commercial vendor,
So this comes back to our conversation from last month about open source program offices and understanding how you use open source software. And it's kind of, I look at this as kind of two independent things. One part of this compliance review is about licenses, about interoperability between the components. Can you use the software the way you want to use it? What are the obligations that you may have as a result of it? Let's say you have AGPL v3 software and you're offering it as a service, making sure that you understand the sources of what do you need to release, under which license do you need to release those sources, how do they need to be accessible? Those are all questions that to me fall into this open source program office legal understanding, what it means to use open source from a legal perspective purview. But what I'm talking about here is more the fitness for purpose from an engineering perspective. So scalability, security, network infrastructure, storage requirements, the engineering side of all this, which is a distinct and different analysis that you need to do, but it's also a very critical analysis that you need to do when you use open source software. And oh, by the way, we talked about commercial open source software and getting open source software from a commercial vendor in the past. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of companies say, I want to get my open source infrastructure from a vendor, because now I delegate this decision-making, this analysis, this understanding of the infrastructure, both on a legal and on an engineering side, to an expert. I pay the money for it, but I don't need to worry about this as much. So a big part of the reason why companies happily use packaged open source software from a vendor is to not have to go through these detailed reviews for all of the components of the project that they're using. I'll give you an example. If you go on one of the common CNCF large community enterprise cloud community websites, and you look at the bill of material for a solution, so bringing up your Kubernetes cluster in 9 minutes, you see these websites everywhere. And if you then go through the projects that you pull in by doing that, you will quickly see that you suddenly start using hundreds of new open source projects that at some level you need to understand what they are, how they work together, whether they are appropriate for your solution, whether the licenses fit together, In a lot of cases, it's all Apache 2, and that's easy, but that's something you need to validate. And to make sure that you understand how all this affects your use case and whether that example that somebody posted on this website is right for your industry, your scale, your need, your problem space. And then let's not ignore the fact that in many industries we have additional regulatory constraints, whether you're in telco, whether you're in pharmaceuticals, whether you're in medicine. There are a lot of spaces where there are additional requirements that you need to sign off that your software fulfills. And you are implicitly signing off on all of the open source components that you use.
So basically, when we look at it, it looks like, as you have it, it's kind of typical software supply chain, right? You have to look at every, basically, that's what you're looking at. One more thing is, since you mentioned, working with commercial vendor, looking at a project, you start using it is nice. But when it comes to day-to-day operation, because you start using the project, that's totally fine. But what about maintaining, managing it, updating it, upgrading it, applying patches to it? So build versus buy. And when you do use all these open source technology, you do need in-house team also who is well equipped, who's kind of an expert in that area, because security becomes a big challenge there. So when you do look at a project, whether it's enterprise ready or not, is it always do it yourself, or you have to at some point look at a vendor that can offer that? Because sometimes the very reason you are looking at an open source project, if it is cost, it becomes much more costly to do it yourself, and you still have that risk that something may still slip under the radar.
Yeah, so I'm very happy that we're using the term open source here and not free software, because free software always has in the English language this weird implication of free cost. And we all know that's not the case. Using open source software has to be a strategic decision because it can be extremely costly. If you end up having to build an engineering team that is able to maintain your open source software stack, and then, Lord forbid, you have a serious problem, whether it's a security problem, whether it's a scalability problem, whether it's a functional correctness problem, and you are suddenly on a deadline to fix a bug in a component that you have very little familiarity with. This is the nightmare scenario of most engineering teams. And this is something that so easily gets forgotten when you talk about using open source software, using open source projects in your environment. Now, I don't want to say this is not solvable. I'm not trying to badmouth open source software. I'm obviously a huge fan of open source solutions. It's just something where I think people need to go in with eyes wide open and with a clear understanding of what this means. And that's kind of what I thought about with the topic of today's conversation. What makes a project appropriate for enterprise use? Please think that through as an enterprise, as a company that is using open source software in your infrastructure. Think through what it means to use that project from all angles. The legal questions, of course, but especially what happens if something goes wrong. I rely on this component, I rely on this software. My business, my customers, my infrastructure, people's lives in some circumstances rely on systems working. What happens if that system goes down? How quickly can you fix this? How can you address concerns? Do you have the expertise? Do you have access to people who have the expertise?
One more thing that is there is that it's not just about looking at a project and picking it up. There may be more than one project that is solving your problem. There are a lot of overlaps in the open source world. There are a lot of gaps also. So when you look at a project and you see, hey, there are 3 different projects, and in most cases, they may all be owned by CNCF. CNCF has a lot of overlap there. So how to kind of navigate through that labyrinth? Because it also means that you yourself have to stay updated with what is going on in that open source world. And I think that brings back to the point of having an open source program office where there is dedicated team who has its toes totally dipped into the water of open source where they do know. But this is still a challenge because, as I was saying earlier, That's because it's open source project doesn't mean it's just like there are five vendors offering a solution, so you'll pick the right vendor. So even in the case of open source, if there are three or four projects, they all solve your problem. How to decide that?
So I don't think that's necessarily a role of a typical open source program office. So some companies have engineering teams in their OSPO. So VMware, for example, we have a fairly big open source technology center that is part of my team. But very often the OSPO is really focused on the legal aspects, on the how do you do this right, compliance, maybe a marketing side to it. And it doesn't have a technical function. But this is really a key challenge for every engineering team. And it's a challenge that is universal, regardless what third-party component you use, whether you use a commercial library or a commercial tool set or an open source library, an open source tool set. The question of which one do you choose and what happens if you choose wrong is always top of mind for, or should always be top of mind for engineering teams. I would say that it's often easier to course correct if what you're using is open source, because it's often easier to migrate from one project to the next project if they are both open source, if they are both CNCF projects that have different approaches to, let's say, monitoring or logging or analysis, where there are lots of different projects out there. I think that's a viable approach. But the underlying understanding that as you make this decision and as you pick one of multiple projects that could solve your problem, you are making a hopefully very educated bet. You are looking at different options and you're saying, I think this is the one that is most aligned with what I'm doing. And so that goes back to what we talked about earlier, Swab, where we said you need to spend the time to understand the community if your use case matches what they think they're developing for. And especially in the cases where you have multiple projects that seem to be very overlapping, spending the time to do that and to do it right, I think is really critical, because it is so easy to look at a project and say, oh, this is done in Go, this one is done in Python, I like Python better, let's use Python, without understanding that maybe those two projects sound very similar, but their underlying goal is very, very different. And that is the big risk that I see a lot of people not pay enough attention to, and where I think it's really important for companies and for engineering teams to spend that time up front, to be aware of the challenge and to make a very educated decision here and not just follow what they saw on some website.
Dirk, once again, thank you for discussing this topic, because the fact is, as easy as it is to look at any open source project, to Google any open source project and start using it, you should it should not be any different than any commercial product that we use. We do a lot of research. We look at the support. We look at we also look at the reputation of the vendor as well. So it's with open source, this is also, you should look at the reputation of that project also, how good or bad. So thanks for sharing all those insights, because most people don't even know about that. They just go to GitHub, start using it, and then they start running into projects, so problems. So Dirk, once again, thank you. I hope that we will see each other again this year on camera. If not, then first of all, Happy New Year. Otherwise, we'll see each other for sure next year. So once again, thank you.
Thanks for having me, Swab. Good talking to you.